Jeff Slack, big round of applause, I think, first of all. And Jeff, I'd like to start with a personal question, really, to you, which is, you've worked for some of the greatest agencies in sport. You've worked for Inter Milan. You ran it commercially, one of the biggest sports properties. You've chosen to work in Formula One. Why?
Well, first of all, it's good to see that there's crashing and sailing as well. That was a great video and a nice. I mean, those of you, I don't know if you're Formula One fans, but a couple years ago, I was introduced to a guy named Lawrence Stroll, who's a big personality, very successful businessman, and he started talking about his vision of bringing Aston Martin back to the Formula One grid, one of the great iconic brands. And the combination kind of a Formula One and Aston Martin and Lawrence was kind of very appealing at the time. So it was not a tough choice, although at the time there were a few things that were concerning to me, one of which was kind of the demographics of Formula One as a sport that seemed to have an older demographic, kind of guys like me, kind of middle-aged white guys, and also the challenges of sustainability. But I think what's happened in the interim, nothing that I had anything to do with, but the sport itself in terms of liberties management and the shows like Drive to Survive have rejuvenated the sport, and it's significant today when you go to meetings and people will say, well, my teenage daughter got me into it, or my college son, his favorite sport is Formula One. And I don't think you would have heard that a few years ago. So been lucky to kind of ride that trend. And then I think on sustainability, the sport is doing a really good job of finally telling the right story. Go to sustainable fuels in 2026. So it was an easy decision, but made easier now by what's happened within the bigger space of the sport.
So when you made the decision to come into Formula One, had the Drive to Survive effect? I mean, the Netflix documentary that, as you said, has skewed the demographics, both younger and more balanced male-female. Had that effect already taken place? Or
not really. I think it was. I think we're only about a season into that. And I think if you recall, those of you that are fans, the first season of Formula One, I think the paddock in Formula One, which is a whole long discussion, kind of a bubble, was a little bit, Mercedes didn't participate and Ferrari didn't participate, and they weren't getting paid. And now, of course, everyone begs Netflix to come to their garage and film and do all that. So I think it was just starting, but I think the first years, it took a year or two, then you had the pandemic. But the sport itself is in really, really good health. It cracked the U.S. market, which is fundamental. Next year, we've got 3 races there, including Las Vegas down the strip at Saturday night. So, and now you see a lot of the tech companies, the U.S. tech companies that I think used to get involved a little bit for European-based marketing, but now are getting involved because it's really a global platform for them.
And are those U.S. companies that you mentioned, are they coming into the sport because of the demographic shift, because of the now 3 races in that market, or other reasons?
I think that one of the selling points of Formula One is a global sport. Next year, the calendar has 24 races, and Russell was obviously talking about how does Sail GP do that? Well, the sport has done that. It's there. It has the races on an annual basis. So if you want to get into a global platform, you can look at things like the World Cup, which is every 4 years, Premier League sponsorships, but Formula One really is truly global. The second is that it's also really about technology. We win or lose based on technology. The car is about 90 to 95% of the performance. So you could take the best driver, put him in the worst car, he doesn't have a chance of winning. You take some of the not as quick drivers and put them in the fast car and they can win. So it's a storytelling platform for tech companies. It's very, very authentic.
And when you've mentioned that, so your team hasn't won a race this season. Is it a case of winner takes most commercially when you're out pitching to brands? Do they want to?
You had to bring that up. That was. Thank you for that, Matthew. I appreciate it. I forgot that we hadn't.
So far.
No, we've been pretty shitty this year, but and that's a whole long conversation about. This is where actually the sport itself, and I'm not a huge expert. I haven't been involved that long, but it's really fascinating because you can start peeling away the surfaces of the sport. Now, who won and why did they win, and what was the strategy at the race, and what were the track conditions, and which car does better and what lap did they change their tires, and which tire, and you get deeper, and what had happened this year is the biggest change in regulations maybe in the history of the sport, where you went from where the sport is about 2 things: your engine, and your aerodynamics. And it used to be that the aero philosophy was it would go over the car and push it down to get your grip. But they decided in order to encourage overtaking, they were going to do something called ground effects. So the air would come under the car, suck your car down. Then in the back, the wind goes up like a vortex, so there's less turbulence. I sound like I know what I'm talking about. I don't
good.
Really, but anyway, that's about as good as I know. But anyway, the point being was we kind of got it wrong, and Mercedes got it wrong. And if you remember the beginning of the season, this porpoising, the guys were bouncing up and down. So, and you can't just switch in mid-course. So we did kind of switch, but clawing that back. But we have a 5-year project. We're building the first new factory in Formula One since 2004, which is pretty incredible. You think of other sports, if you were a football team and said, be the first new stadium in 20 years, which includes a wind tunnel. It's a 200 million pound project. We'll open the first building in May, 250,000 square feet. So we're putting together the organization. We've hired a bunch of good people. So the long-term project, I hope, is there. And when we sit down and do this in a couple of years, you'll be saying how many races we won that year.
And you're talking about storytelling, and I was mentioning that my sense is that winner takes most, that the top teams get the most sponsorship. But you've had success in the commercial area. So
well, that's not true. So sorry.
No, this is why I'm asking.
This is one of the reasons that I was excited about the position, because the brand is extraordinary. The Aston Martin brand is really, and I had it intuitively, I felt that, but since I've been involved with the team, it's been extraordinary. I think with Ferrari, Ferrari's an incredible brand and incredible history in Formula One, much deeper than, I'm not comparing this to Ferrari, but in terms of kind of aspirational brands, and if those of you saw the last Bond movie, and it was kind of like an Aston Martin commercial. It was a really thing. So that's been great. And it's funny, despite our lack of success on the track, our partners are really happy. We're growing significantly. They all want to continue. We get every weekend, and this is actually very rewarding, emails from people saying that was the greatest weekend of my life. Or I remember one from a woman who's, I think from City, whose son went, he was 7 years old, and it was one of those cute little videos saying, "Mommy, that was the greatest day I've ever had." So you see those things, and Formula One is really good at that, and that's win or lose, because not many teams win, if you think about it. I mean, the sport is trying, and they're doing a really good job of making it more competitive, but it's just a great experience. You get to touch and feel the sport, you get to go in the garage, you get to see the drivers. I've never seen a sport where you can kind of connect so much. Of course, the hospitality is very good. So for us, I know it would be nicer if we were on the podium and doing better, but it has not detrimentally affected our program. In fact, the opposite. We've really grown significantly in the commercial area.
Because Formula One is technology driven, I did something called crowdsourcing for questions for you, Jeff. And one of the questions actually relates to this, which was, you're impressed by that, I can tell. What does commercial success look like for the team in the next 3 to 5 years? And how do you measure success over and above dollar amounts, given that the sport now has a cost cap and you can't spend?
Yeah, well, the cost cap is a soft cap, if you want to use kind of U.S. terminology. So we spend a lot more than the cost cap. I think commercial success would be continuing to grow. What you'd want to do is we start off with a very small program, and the first year we signed 9 new partners. My first success is making them happy and keeping them with us, and a lot of those deals expire at the end of next year, so we'll see how that goes. We've signed a big new partner in Aramco for a number of years, so it's the stability and the building upon that, and I'm very comfortable we're on that track. So I guess we don't have huge concerns. I do think it brings up an interesting point, which is valuations of these teams, and I think what we're finding, and when I took over, I said to Lawrence, look, I think this is kind of US-style franchise valuations, which are being traded now at multiples of revenue. For those of us that are, studied finance, that's a very unique thing. Most people look at EBITDA. We don't have any EBITDA. We lose money right now. That will be a start to kind of get to break even. But it doesn't matter in the sense that the financial world and even sophisticated investors now are coming to us. Every day we get inquiries about investing in the team. There's only 10 teams, many of whom you can't invest in anyway. So the scarcity value plus the growth of the sport and the track record and the contracted revenues are really driving up, I think, valuations on the teams. And so even though we're not winning, as you mentioned, as shareholders seem to be very happy right now, let's put it that way, at least on paper.
Yes. I'm sure Mr. Stroll would like a win or two at some point. So,
Yeah.
when you're pitching to brand leaders, sports sponsorship in the past used to be very much a case of chairman's choice.
Yeah.
And you needed there to be a petrol head within the organization. Is that still true? And how do you?
Not really. I mean, I think you're right. I think the world at this level, you're talking about deals that are in the tens of millions of dollars a year. CEOs and boards just don't do that anymore because the guy likes the sport. That's not. We have to justify ourselves every day. But what I have found was a bit surprised because when I took over the team, just because of its history of not being a big brand, it was called Racing Point before that, Force India. It didn't have a lot, take social. I think we were last on the grid in social in terms of followers. And I thought that would be a big challenge, and it hasn't. One, we've invested a lot in that, so now we're fifth on the way to fourth, and we went from last in per follower engagement to first, so didn't take that for granted, but that's not what people are not doing this for a CPM deal. They are doing it for the storytelling platform, for the hospitality. Because of the Aston Martin brand, we get a lot of B2B-based companies that are entertaining their guests because they like to be affiliated with the brand. So that's driven it more than a CPM basis, which I have found is helpful because we wouldn't do very well if we were doing it on a CPM basis.
Because the winning teams are the ones that win all the media.
Yes, but it's expensive, and I think, in the world of CPMs, you can go and you could buy social media and just narrow down the price, but it's not that. It's all of those other things that combine to make it value added. And I said, the conversations we're having with our partners is that they all want to continue and they're all very happy. So that means that we're doing what we're supposed to in terms of hitting those objectives.
And you can put the price up in the next cycle then.
That would be the idea. Yeah.
The other question I had from the audience, and thank you, you know who you are. In a sport driven by data on the track, you've hired some talented people off track who seem to be doing great things with fan engagement. How is that translated into a D2C strategy? And how much first-party fan data do you have? And can you provide some examples of how it's delivered value?
Well, Formula One, again, back to the authenticity of the technology platform, it's all about data. I mean, we live and breathe. There's sensors on the car. We have a million data points produced all the time. And our success is based on how well we analyze that and understand of all that data what matters and how quickly. I mean, if you're during the races, the decisions have to be made in kind of real time. So that's very good. In terms of the fan aspect, I don't think the data has yet, and maybe we should do a better job of that translated too much. It's been more about diving deeper for those people that want to know about the way the tech works. We just did a big interview. We hired a guy named Dan Fallows, who was the #2 aero guy at Red Bull, who is just a genius at this stuff. And we did a long internal, we did produce it internally, but external to the world, about how that all works with the aero using the data and things. So we're trying to give people that kind of content if they want to dive a bit deeper. But because Formula One controls the feed and the things that are sent around, unlike when I was at Inter and we had a lot of our own secondary rights, we don't have any secondary rights. So it's not like I have an AMF1 channel that we put out. We just use our social. So we have somewhat limited capabilities to kind of engage in that way.
When Liberty Media took over Formula One, one of the things I enjoyed seeing in the sport was people coming into it. Chase Carey, the CEO, Sean Bratches, the commercial leader, who were, by their own admission, completely ignorant of the sport,
yeah,
and thought F1 was a key on their keyboard,
yeah,
and were asking questions. And Sean would say things like, Matthew, why are the cars on the grid only for 20 minutes? Because this is one of the best parts of the show. The cars are lined up, everybody's
yeah,
watching, it's exciting. And I said, it's just traditional. But he said, I keep asking people, and they have, no, you couldn't have the pit. You couldn't,
yeah.
And it is now longer. So the question to you is, are there some things that have surprised you about Formula One, now that you're working inside it, that you hadn't anticipated?
Well, okay, there's two interesting themes your question. First is kind of Americans like me coming into international sports like Formula One and saying, well, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? And I don't know if you saw that the guy that bought Chelsea, Todd Bowley, recently came out and said, we should have an all-star game in the Premier League, North versus South. And those of us that know football, you kind of say, wait a minute, when are you going to do that? And you're going to have Manchester United players with Man City players, with Liverpool players playing. I mean, this is going to be kind of interesting. So you have to question things, but I think you have to do it with enough knowledge of the sport that your questions are possible, relevant, aren't going to, and I think maybe in Todd's case he overreached. But in Formula One, I guess the things that have surprised me, I guess how little the teams interact. I don't know. I was expecting that. I do very little with my counterparts now. At the team principal level, they do, it's always a battle, and they're always, which team voting for this and why you're voting, which is fun part of the sport because it certainly makes for good drama. But I thought there'd be a little more collegiality in that from that standpoint. And certainly at the commercial level, we don't ever really, we just kind of compete and don't say anything about it, and we want to win that one and they win that one. So that's been a bit different. My experience in football is I was certainly a lot closer, and when I was at Inter with the AC Milan guys or the Juventus people, than I am in Formula One with the other guys, which is fine. It's just...
Do you think that's because you're competing probably for the similar group of brands?
I think first, there's no real forum for it. We don't really have a forum. Most of the stuff in Formula One is all about technology and rules and regulations, and so those have lots of forum for it. We don't really have a forum for that in terms of the marketing commercial element.
Yeah. Your team name is, I think, probably the longest in the sport, and it's got 3 significant brands in it. Your own, Aston Martin, it's got Aramco, it's got Cognizant. Could you just tell us about perhaps either of those two, Aramco and Cognizant, the process you went through of getting them into the sport, the proposition you put to them?
Oh, 2 totally different experiences. First, in Formula One, look, we have 2 sources of revenue. It's really simple. What we get from FOM, based on where you finish in historic data, which I don't have a lot of control over, that's the performance that you talked about. And the second is partnerships. We don't have media to sell. We have no stadia. We're not selling tickets. So it's really important that we do that well. Cognizant was doing kind of a beauty parade. They decided, and I think they're involved with SailGP, they wanted to, they're a big company. They're a Fortune 175 company with 300,000 employees, market cap, at least a couple months ago, 50 billion. I don't know what's happening to that today, but but nobody knew who they were, so they wanted to build their brand, and they decided to go to sports. So anytime you do that in sports, everybody comes knocking at your door. We went through the process, probably took 2 months, and which was very short, very fast. We started talking in October, and we had a deal December 15th, 2020. So. Aramco was the opposite. It was probably a year and a half. I think as we previously discussed, a very large company, unique culture, clearly makes sense for motorsports, a petrochemical company. But a very different experience. But it was great that we could put those 2 together, and really provides the financial future of the team, having 2 partners that are locked in for a long period of time.
And in the case of Cognizant, it sounds like, and I don't know how much of this you can reveal, but you were up against other sports properties outside of Formula One, inside?
Yeah, everything. I mean, from all world of football, Manchester United, Liverpool, to other Formula One teams. That's the other weird thing sometimes. We're talking to a potential partner, and Formula One is as well. So you're kind of, sports teams a little bit here, but it works out okay. But so no, they were talking to everybody, and that, so that felt good, because it isn't just your proposition; it's how you present it, the relationships you have. You understand enough about them to know what matters to them. It's not just saying how great you are. It's, wow, this could fit for Cognizant. So that went really well.
And we've touched earlier on diversity and inclusivity, which are words that are often thrown around. But how important have you found those when you're talking to brands like Aramco and Cognizant and others that you have on the car?
Hugely important. Look, the world is ESG today, and is really important. And Formula One is another thing I probably should. It's been really not good at it. I mean, look, watch the races. I mean, it's not diverse. Not a lot of women out there. Not a lot of people of color. Sport's got a long way to go on that. I made one of the hallmarks when we started this was to say we're going to be a very progressive team. We're going to think about it differently. We did things like we signed a woman named Jess Hawkins, who's a W Series driver, stunt driver for the Bond Series, LBGQ+. She's a great lady, and our partners love her. And most people don't know her. She's not a superstar in terms of a name recognition, but she's really done a lot for us in terms of explaining what we're trying to accomplish as a team. So the sport needs to do a much better job in that, and we're trying to invest in that as well.
And part of it's the storytelling, isn't it? I don't know, does anybody in the room know that the Formula One engines are hybrids? I mean, I know it because I work in the sport. Anybody else knew that they were hybrid engines? Yeah, so they're just, it's incredible. The technology is, it's 1/4 of the power now is regenerated, as you know, and it's going to move to half of the power that's used. So it's part of the solution to the sustainability problem. And as you say, it's a story so that moves on to the second question I've got here, which is Aston Martin Formula One team is a stakeholder in Formula One, and it's as much as it's moving towards a franchise model. How much control do you have over the future of the sport when it's controlled by a separate company?
Not that much. I mean, we don't, we in terms of the business aspect of it, luckily, I think Liberty's done an amazing job. I mean, Bernie Ecclestone is one of the great entrepreneurs in sports history, and, the people that work there, the stories they tell are incredible and old school kind of stuff, but what the guy you needed to herd all the cats at a time, Liberty's just the next level in terms of getting it and how they've gotten the U.S. market now, and what they're going to do, I think, in Asia is fantastic. So I think the sport's in really good hands. And we don't have a lot of, we have a slight input into that, but not enormously. Our focus is on building the best team we can, the new factory, making it competitive, which are the things that we can control.
So we've seen shifts in sports over the various eras, the TV rights money starting to drive. We've talked about social media and the influence of that, first-party data, the Netflix drive to survive. If you can see around the corner to what's coming up in the next era that you're going to be tackling?
I think it's more interactivity with the fans. I mean, the great thing about Formula One, again, is it's just you can choose which car you want to watch. I mean, if we have that on board of our drivers when you watch it, which is a totally different thing than you get on the international feed that's just showing part of the race. But when you see what these guys go through, and I do think the sport hasn't done a good job with that, is the level of athleticism. We have this thing called hot laps where you get in an Aston Martin and you drive around the track with one of our reserve drivers at a race day, so the stands are full, and people get out of that, which is like half or three-quarters of the speed of a Formula One car out of one lap, and you kind of get out of the car like that. These guys are doing 50, 60, 70 laps like that. So I think they need to bring that to light a little more, maybe even, what are the biometrics associated with the app? It's how you can choose that, and I think, again, Formula One has got such depth into that. So I think that interactivity, the access to data that you mentioned, the sport can continue to grow significantly. The second thing you said is the storytelling, because most people don't know, as you say, that these are the most efficient engines in the world. The statistic that I heard was if you took all the Formula One races all year long and all the carbon footprint that it left, it's something like 3 747s taking off. It's getting to the races but Formula E has the same thing. They fly to the race. So it's actually not carbon footprint. It's just become a bit of a poster child for that. But they are addressing that in a good way. But the engines are, 6-cylinder engines producing 1,000 horsepower. These things are incredible machines.
Final question, Singapore Grand Prix this weekend. I mean, obviously you've come to Singapore for the All That Matters conference, but
yes,
I presume you're going to
happen to be a race, yeah.
How important do you think is, amongst the 23, 24 races, how important is the Singapore Grand Prix?
That's very important because, we haven't been able to go to China. Asia, I think, if you look at the globe, Europe has always been a hotbed for Formula One, not a problem in terms of the history of the sport. The U.S. is an important market to crack. That's now happening. And I think Asia, for sure, now is a place that the sport needs to grow. Of course, COVID has set that back a bit, but this is one of the greatest stops on the circuit. People love it. Singapore itself is booming. We know it's gotten a lot of people from other parts of Asia that moved here. So this is essential for us as a kind of linchpin for us to develop the sport.
Absolutely. So 2 years away, 7-year deal that's just been signed by Singapore. So the Grand Prix is going to be here for a while. Unfortunately, Mr. Slack has to go and find some more sponsors to drive the performance of his team forward. Big round of applause, please, for Jeff Slack.
Thank you.